Hi, welcome to the September 3rd meeting of the Kubernetes VMware User Group. So I posted links to the agenda doc. I was going to do a little bit of material on troubleshooting running Kubernetes on top of the vSphere hypervisor. I've got a deck ready. I apologize. We had a speaker cancellation just a few days ago, and I was on PTO, so I kind of rushed this together, but I've got a little something. And then Miles was going to talk about some recent work on a Helmchart for installing the CSI storage plugin that in a way that interoperates with the cloud provider plugin that David Von Thenen implemented. And David is on the air too, and feel free, David, to chime in on any comments or remarks you want to make. Do you want to go first, Miles, or do you want me to?
Yeah, no, I'll go first because mine's fairly concise anyway. So let me just share my browser. Oh, host disabled attendee screen
I just
sharing.
made you co-host.
Awesome. Let's try that again. Cool. Safari. Can you see that?
Yes.
Okay. So Cormac and myself have received a lot of feedback from field saying CSI is too hard to install, or not really too hard, but too error prone. Very, very easy to mess it up. So we asked engineering, you know, is there Helmchart on the sort of go? Is it a priority, whatever? They're working on an operator, and so Helmchart comes secondary to the operator. So they're focused on that, and we thought, well, how hard can it be? So we implemented a Helmchart for CSI ourselves. It also installs the CPI as well. So David wrote a Helmchart for the CPI a while back. This is the CSI Helmchart. Whenever you install it, lists that as a prerequisite or as a dependency. So it'll automatically install the CPI for you as well. So if you have a vanilla Kubernetes cluster, this makes it way easier to get up and running actually. So at the minute, it only deploys CSI version 2.0, which is backwards compatible with 6.7 U3 as well. And it has all of the new support around read-write many volumes and all that good stuff. So basically, we've set up something. We expect this to be moved away from Cormac's GitHub maybe in the next 2 weeks or so once we get the pull request opened into the CSI driver repository so that it can be hosted somewhere that's sort of VMware official and not just, you know, a personal GitHub. So at the minute, you add Cormac's chart repository, you do a repo update, then there's just some stuff around testing it if you want to test it, how you do the template and see what it's going to install. But the actual sort of bits and pieces that make it work, here's the sort of required config. So you can see config.enabled is true, the vCenter, username, password for the vCenter, the data center in the vCenter, and then the cluster ID says change me. So just you fill that in with whatever string you want. And currently, we also have to duplicate the same information as we have here for the CPI, because it requires the same information, but the way the Helm charts are written, we can't sort of use the same parameter for both. So I did some changes and opened a PR with David's Helm chart that exposed global variables. And the idea is that instead of having config.vcenter and vSphere CPI.config.vcenter, we just have a global.config.vcenter, and then that'll apply to both things. Because generally what we've seen people do is they just install the CPI and CSI into the exact same environment with the same config. Very, very rarely do they change. So we're going to leave these in here as overrides. And the idea is that we'll set a global so that you just can't mess the config up from one to the other. So if you run this, it'll go ahead, install the CPI, install the CSI, and it'll come up. It's really that simple.
I hope you don't mind if I interrupt you, but and maybe I'm going to put David on the spot here too for this duplication. I'm a little rusty in Helm charts, but I think that you should be able to set these using environment variables in a way that you could write a bash script or something to reuse it in kind of one pass, right? Because I mean, these set commands could just pull something out of an environment variable. And if I'm not mistaken, there's a way to feed these in through YAML, or am I wrong about that, David?
Yeah, you can do both. But like what Miles has here, it's like with that global config thing, it's pretty cool because it wouldn't require the dependency of like an external script. So like that's kind of like another benefit of that. So yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I hadn't thought about doing the bash script actually and just making these envars and on both of them, because then you can't mess it up too. I suppose that would be a nice stopgap until we get the global stuff added in.
Yeah, there's a lot of people who are security experts, and I'm rusty on this too, just know enough to be dangerous, but there's some issues as to whether people like these things that involve passwords potentially falling into log files and things, and that some ways of setting these are safer than others to not leave footprints in the sand that maybe could be discovered later. So I don't know, it's maybe beyond the scope. We're just pointing out here in this meeting that the facility's available, but
Right.
I think there's opportunity to embellish this later, and maybe we'll get some blog posts out, or I think Miles and I are planning a talk at KubeCon North America later this year. So maybe we can have a more polished version of this prepared for that.
Right, yeah. And be under no illusion here, like this took Cormac and me like half a day to do. So this is very, very much an MVP. We got it to work. We tested it on a couple of environments. It seemed okay. And we threw it out to the community. So it's something that's there. It's probably not as robust as it should be, but it does the job because as far as CSI is concerned anyway, the configuration is really very simple. It's just the secret that needs updated. So it was pretty low hanging fruit. All the other niceties around this, that is stuff that, we would welcome any feedback that you guys have on this.
Yeah, I guess the good thing about this being early stages and, still informative stages is that if any users are out here either live in the meeting or watch the YouTube video later, please let us know now, because it's often much easier to do these before you get the official version 1 out there and have the documentation locked down, because changes then require a bunch of edits and PRs and all that, and maybe we can get it right on the first pass with the right amount of feedback.
That'd be nice, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
So we've just got an example command. If this wasn't clear enough, here's the actual values that you'd want to fill in. And then we have another one. If you're using vSAN and you want vSAN file services support, then we fill that out with how you set up the extra config for vSAN file services as well. And then the uninstall. So really pretty simple. It's out there now. Give it a bash. It's probably the easiest way to get up and running with CSI and CPI on vanilla installs.
And just in case for you newcomers, if you weren't aware of the functioning of this group, we're prepared to support running Kubernetes on we're prepared to support running all forms of Kubernetes on vSphere. So it doesn't have to be a VMware distribution. It could be OpenShift, it could be Rancher, it could be that you roll your own right off the GitHub repository, but this group operates under the auspices that we support all forms of Kubernetes on the vSphere platform. Okay, is that it? Do you want me to?
There was just one thing I wanted to add after you'd said that. The Helmchart in its current iteration, I know it doesn't work on Red Hat OpenShift because I've tried it, because they require a specific, I think they call it security context config, SCC. And we just haven't built out the YAML for that yet. So I know it doesn't work on Red Hat OpenShift, but it does work on stuff that doesn't have like any other additional requirements around security or anything like that. So it'll work fine on Rancher. Let's put it that way.
To be fair, a lot of these distributions already have their own polished installer that take these kind of inputs. And if I were a user of those, or VMware's, some of VMware's Kubernetes distributions do this too, I'd go with the documented path, because if you end up going into a support engagement and you tell them you did something different from the one that's in there, standard workflow in the documentation, it's probably just going to slow things down. They might ask you to do it over again anyway. So maybe this kind of thing is more useful. I know I play around with these using this in home lab scenarios and things like that. And a lot of people just getting started aren't prepared yet to even make a selection of a commercial distribution. So I think that's the prime audience for something like these tools. And like I say, many of those distributions are already going to have the equivalent of this, or maybe even better in terms of validating parameters as you put them into whatever UI or other mechanism they have.
So I have tested it on Rancher and it does work, actually, earlier today.
Oh,
The
great.
Helm chart?
Yeah.
Awesome. Good to know.
I saw it tweeted out and then tested it out this morning.
Okay, cool.
Okay, I'm really glad you joined us today and gave us that feedback. That helps a lot.
Hey, Miles, for the pod, are you talking about the pod security context?
Yes, I am. Yeah.
Yeah. So actually, if you want an example of that, that's actually implemented in the CPI chart. So you might be able to just like
Perfect.
lift and shift it over. So
that would be great. Okay, I think I will do that because at the minute, trying to install CSI on OpenShift is a bit of a pain. So that would be awesome. I'll take a look at that.
It definitely has the, like if you want to enable it or not, it has that flag, and then it has a lot of the stuff that's like templated out where you can also override usual like values that most people kind of want to override. So but it's there for you to kind of take a look at if you want.
Did you just hide it behind like a distro equals OpenShift, or just behind security context config enable or something like that?
Yeah, it's a security context config enabler. Yep.
Awesome. Perfect.
Yep.
Okay, I'll move on then to Dick. I apologize that I literally was editing this up until 5 minutes before the meeting started. So I haven't had a chance to go proofread it. So forgive me if there's any egregious typos in here, but let me give this a try. And I had aspired to doing a live demo of some of these things that I put in this PowerPoint, but I'm traveling at the moment, family related matter, and I found that I'm having to connect through 2 layers of VPN, and I can't actually get command line on some of the things I'd like to right now. So no live demo, but I tried some of what's in these slides before I left. So let me share my presentation. And I think you should be able to see a PowerPoint deck. Can somebody confirm that? Okay, good.
All good, Steve. Yeah.
And let me throw this into presenter mode. And okay, so this is an intro to troubleshooting on vSphere. What do you do when things go wrong? Just kind of where do you go to find your log files is what this amounts to. So I'll start with a brief overview of what's involved with running Kubernetes on vSphere. Maybe this is too elementary for our audience, but we do get some people who watch later on YouTube. So forgive me if this is kind of too 101 for any of you, but I think it might help some people. Then I'm going to cover where this applies and where it doesn't, because I'm skipping some kind of older platforms and releases, and then finally leave with resources. So there's 2 parts here, the cloud provider being the first one. And this is an interface that allows Kubernetes to abstract out the complexity and variances of different hosting platforms. vSphere is one when you're running on-prem, but public clouds would be the other major hosting platform, anything from Amazon AWS to Google Cloud or Azure Cloud. The cloud provider's goal is to make those look close, similar enough that you can design applications that are portable and can't tell and don't care where they're running. The key element of this cloud provider is the node abstraction, and that's what provisions and integrates in the Kubernetes nodes. On vSphere, that would be the VMs that act as Kubernetes cluster nodes. A value add that's unique to the vSphere cloud provider is that it does support respecting availability zones that are implemented in the underlying infrastructure, and at the same time tying that in with storage. There are some optional features of cloud providers handling routing and load balancing that the vSphere cloud provider does not do, and that's intentional because what the scenario in a public cloud is that the vendor would typically implement network routing, ingress, a load balancer as a service. And I'm not even sure that you could, even if you wanted to, use an external solution for that. But when you go on-prem, there's a trade-off of being opinionated and forcing the user to abide by your decision as to what the best load balancer is, or leaving it open. And the vSphere cloud provider leaves it open. There's good reasons for that. If your idea of an on-premise vSphere is a really large data center with multiple aisles, something like a physical F5 as a load balancer makes sense. But on the other hand, if you're going into a remote office, retail store, an F5 appliance might be overkill, and you might be looking at something like a container hosted open source load balancer as an alternative. So by not integrating in the load balancer integration, we've left it open for multiple possible solutions by the user. The other major abstraction with Kubernetes is the storage plugin. And in modern times, that storage plugin is CSI, the container storage interface. If you went back to 2016 or 2017, 2018-ish, there were in-tree plugins. That is something that is out there, still available, but deprecation warnings have already been issued. There's both in-tree storage plugins as well as an in-tree cloud provider. They still are supported. However, they've already gone a little over a year with no feature enhancements. So they're in a phase where they're getting security patched, but all new features are going into the out-of-tree variants of this. And today I'm only going to cover troubleshooting using the out-of-tree tools. In a new deployment, there's pretty much no reason to use those in-tree variants. The only reason I can possibly imagine for that is that the new out-of-trees do require vSphere 6.7 U3 or newer, and they do require relatively recent versions of Kubernetes, but we're talking things by recent, I mean, you don't want to be using multi-year-old Kubernetes, but I can't imagine why anybody would want to do that anyway. And I have encountered people who do want to use the older vSphere simply because maybe in a home lab, they've got really old hardware that doesn't support the new one, but kind of we're approaching a date soon where the answer to that is just, hey, it's too bad. It's time to move on. It's
do they have a date for when that will be removed? Or which version of Kubernetes the entry will be removed from?
Yeah,
the VCP.
Of the what?
The VCP, the vSphere cloud provider.
Well, you've got the cloud provider, you've got the storage as well. Yeah. So yeah.
Well, the in-tree one is actually both in the one thing. So the VCP covers storage and the cloud provider. Current plan of record looks like 1.21, which I think is the beginning of next year. It moves around a little bit. There's some talk of 1.22, but it basically, the hard requirement for it to be removed is that VCP to CSI migration is there and stable. So when that happens, then it'll be removed.
Yeah, this has been something where I'm a little skeptical because they've thrown out times that have always been essentially any time in my memory, it's been, we'll do it next year. And then the new year comes around and then it's still the next year after that. So I think you're definitely safe through the end of this year. And a lot of it depends on how much you believe these, whether these dates are hard numbers or wishful thinking. And I guess I don't want to go on the record of my personal opinion, but I think you're definitely safe through the end of this year. And when it comes about, one thing to keep in mind for vSphere is that the two are tied together because the out-of-tree cloud provider isn't designed to work within tree storage. It kind of might, but I don't think it's tested, and I wouldn't recommend it. So that you're going to likely flip the two of them at the same time in the same act. There is a migration plan for the storage that I believe is destined to allow you, they will replace the current in-tree storage driver with something that passes through calls to the out-of-tree one. And that solution should handle the storage angle, but I'm not so sure about the cloud provider angle.
Yeah, I can give you a little bit more detail on the storage thing. So that's the VCP to CSI migration that I was referring to. We essentially take the VCP calls and it becomes just like a shim layer, and all those calls get passed on to the CSI. There's some internal discussion at the minute, obviously, on how we translate stuff that was supported in VCP that isn't supported in CSI. For example, like raw SPVM parameters that were in VCP, not in CSI. So how do we support and translate those into the new way of doing things? So there is some complexity around it. But the idea is stable, that it will be a completely transparent operation, that it will change the backend disk types from VMDKs to FCDs, and does all of that stuff for you. So it should be something that you basically just don't notice.
So was that a good enough answer for you, Bryson, or do you want?
Yeah, we were just talking about this morning. We've just had, I mean, COVID's thrown off our upgrade plans for the whole year of things, and so I mean, we're on a lot of places where 6.7 U2, but we're trying to get to U3, and now it's like, well, maybe we'll just go to 7.0, but then you've got to do testing for that, and then we still have a lot of places to roll out to. So we're just trying to see what we're continually upgrading to the newer Kubernetes versions, and at what point are we going to run out and not be able to upgrade Kubernetes because of the VMware underneath?
Yeah.
So that's what we're trying to understand.
So if you've got any opinions on the matter, we're prepared to take those under advisement too. We're always looking for feedback from users. So feel free if whatever you've heard, or if you've got hard limits or difficulties that would be caused by some date, let us know and we'll see what we can do about it. The other thing to throw out there with regard to any systems you do have to upgrade, that migration plan, the last I heard, and Miles, you're a better authority on than I am perhaps, but I think that they were expecting that you wouldn't go to 7.0, but it would be 7.0 something else, right?
I think they're waiting for 7.0 U1 that's supposed to come out, I guess, in a couple months.
Right. So currently the plan for the migration stuff is the Kate's bit is going to be compatible with 1.19 and above. So that is beta, or will be beta in 1.19. So that part will be there. It'll require the next version of vSphere, whatever number we choose for that. But we are in discussions as to earlier versions. How do we support earlier versions of the platform, whether in a patch release or otherwise? We haven't made any firm decisions on that. Current plan of record is it's going to require a new version of vSphere, but we'll see if that changes based on feedback. And we've received a lot of feedback to say it should change. So if you have more feedback, let us know.
Okay.
Thank you.
Unless you've got anything else on that subject, I'll advance my slide deck. So with regard to the Cloud Control Manager, this, it's the interface to the vSphere hypervisor that's hosting the VMs acting as Kubernetes nodes. There is going to be a Cloud Controller Manager pod. Typically, there's going to be one. There may be mechanisms to deploy more than one, but one is going to be, it's going to use leader election, I believe, is the way it works. So you can kubectl in with admin credentials, get the pods in the system namespace. Some people's distributions, or if you're rolling your own from open source, maybe you could have put this in a namespace other than kube system, but I think it's typically in kube system. Get the list of pods, just grep for the word cloud usually is going to work. Maybe you'll get a false positive, but for me on my system, this worked. Gets you a pod name. Then you can do kubectl logs with the name of that pod. Just say all containers, and that will dump your logs. What you'd expect to show up there, generally the reason most people would even be concerned with getting logs is that something's not working right. But you can see the parsing of the configuration file at the very beginning of those logs. And if you had any issues related to an element of that configuration being bad, or an authentication problem on whatever account credentials you use being bad, you could expect it to show up there with a little bit of detail that should be enough to get you started as to maybe what line items are at fault in your configuration, or adding some additional details when you go seek help in Slack through your vendor, whatever path you choose to go. Does anybody else have anything more to add on the on troubleshooting the vSphere cloud provider and things that they found through the logs that might be helpful to others? Sounds like no, but anyway, this is a decent starting point. The docs do have some material on this, but they maybe have advisories like go get the logs, and sometimes beginners could even use a little guidance on the kubectl commands for even getting logs. I know we have people out there who are absolute rookies trying to learn their way up Kubernetes. So forgive me if this is a little too elementary, but I think it should be helpful to some people. The other place that you can look at on the other end of this is that as these Kubernetes nodes are being deployed and as storage is being attached, the standard vSphere logs will show those activities from the vSphere perspective. So you can see the volumes getting mounted into the VMs in the recent tasks window of the UI. And then with vSphere itself, I think it's fair to say that most people use a log gathering solution, whether it be Log Insight, Wavefront, or taking it to Splunk or whatever. Pretty much vSphere will allow consolidation of logs to whatever you choose. And sometimes it's helpful to look at things from the vSphere perspective. If it's just getting your Kubernetes cluster off the ground, I think the Kubernetes logs are more likely to be your first step. But if it's something like intermittent connections or logs or volume mounts that won't go away, what you would find in the vSphere logs may be a useful adjunct to this. Anything you want to add on that with regard to that, Miles? Or does this look good?
No, I think that's pretty good. The other useful part of the UI would be, if you're using CSI, would be go into the cluster level and then monitor, and then there's the container cloud native storage UI that we've got there that shows you the PVs, what they're mounted into. you know, what the storage class is it compliant, all that good stuff. So you can see all of the infrastructure and the Kubernetes layer stuff in there. So if you have a volume that's been provisioned and you're trying to troubleshoot that, that's a good place to go.
Yeah, and I apologize for doing kind of this lousy screenshot, but I'm stuck in a hotel room through double VPNs and I couldn't get back to my vSphere to do a live demo of this like I had hoped. So moving on to the CSI storage plugin and how you would troubleshoot by getting logs there. The first step is to actually find the pods that are related to CSI, and that line in yellow, kubectl get pods, all namespaces grepping for CSI is generally going to work. It's kind of it's a pretty broad pattern net, but I don't think it's likely that you'd have any other pods running with CSI in the name. So this would generally work for me. And you're going to find that the pods are going to have multiple containers. Depending on what issue you have, you could dump all the logs from all the containers at once, which is that kubectl logs. You've got the name there. So on my system, my name was vSphere CSI controller -0, and then saying all containers. You might have as many as 5 containers in there that have different functions. So you can isolate them by one if you know your problem is scoped down to one particular area. There's the vSphere CSI controller, the attacher, the syncer, the provisioner, and they all have different roles in the phase of how this thing goes down through the phases of allocating a persistent volume claim, creating a persistent volume, syncing between the Kubernetes world and the vSphere world, attaching these volumes to VMs as part of the process of bonding a volume to a stateful application that's running under Kubernetes. Miles, do you have any color you want to add on?
Just a little bit, yeah. In my experience, the only one that you'll get useful logs out of, as in if you're trying to troubleshoot volume provisioning or something like that, is the vSphere CSI controller container. Attacher, provisioner, all that stuff is usually 100%. And the vSphere syncer is basically just a metadata syncer. All it does is pulls labels and tags and stuff like that from Kubernetes and syncs them into the vSphere UI. So it's not in the control path of actually provisioning volumes and stuff. So if you're trying to troubleshoot actual volume work, it's almost always the vSphere CSI controller that you want to look at.
Okay, good to know. And I think there's one other one that's pretty much always going to be, some of these they're not even unique to vSphere, because the CSI project, I think, provides some of these sidecars just as a generic implementation across all storage, all flavors of storage. And I believe there's some sort of a keep alive one there too, that is just the health check that this pod is actually running. But unless things are totally hosed, I wouldn't expect that you'd find any useful troubleshooting information by looking at the logs out of that container. But
yeah, the only two that we actually provide are the ones prepended with vSphere dash. So there are only 2 containers that we actually ship: vSphere CSI controller and vSphere syncer. All the other containers that run as part of that pod are all provided by upstream.
yeah, and it's not to say that those are guaranteed bug free. I mean, someday somebody might run into an issue in one of those, but it's rare. And
yeah, they're pretty mature.
so I don't know what happened here. I had some more slides. Oh, here we go. I guess my laptop is just slow here. Okay. Okay, so here's some additional resources. This is just, in addition, obviously, you should read the docs, and the docs are the bottom of this list. But I did find for people moving from in-tree to out-of-tree, there was a good blog post by Eric Shanks. and it actually had cut and paste examples of a configuration in tree and comparing it to one out of tree. Miles and Cormac Hogan, who's not on the call, I just recommend their blogs for just about everything, and I didn't put them here, but those are great resources just overall time. There is a deep dive here on, this is from the Kubernetes perspective, on the principles that went into moving the cloud providers from in tree to out of tree. And this really is a deep dive. Like, I don't think the average user has to go there, but if you really want an in-depth that would allow you to troubleshoot maybe the most difficult problems and explain what some of the terminology is, that's a good starting. I mean, that is the historical design docs. A less detailed overview that's kind of a little easier to digest is that third link. And then for the storage plugin, there is a known issues list being maintained. The one there that I remember was that there's potentially a race condition involved with deleting a persistent volume compared to deleting a VM that it might be attached to, that maybe is something to watch out for, triggered by deleting a whole namespace at a time. There were a few other issues on that list, and that list probably is going to, it's maintained, so it might change over time, but that's something to be aware of. If you think that whatever you might be seeing as you're troubleshooting might be something that perhaps somebody else has already encountered, you might want to go to this list to just poke around and see what's there. Anything else to add, Miles? I think this is the end of my deck, so.
No, that about covers it really. I would just say if you do have storage problems, it's usually you haven't enabled node_UUID, which is a prerequisite. It's listed in the docs, but usually that's the problem. And if it's not that, username and password's probably wrong for Virtual Center. So it's usually one of those two things. Or you're not running it on 6.7 U3 or above, as we've had recently. A couple of people saying, hey, why doesn't this work? And it gives you these really weird errors. Make sure that your vSphere infrastructure is at U3 or above to use the CSI driver.
Okay, good advice. I'm going to stop the share. Yeah, I see Bryson wanting a link to the agenda, so let me throw it in there. Just a minute, Bryson. The odd thing about Slack or about Zoom is that if you join late and somebody already put something in chat, I don't think your own window doesn't show it.
I think he's asking for the link to the slides to be added to the agenda so they can look at the slides afterwards.
Yeah, okay, I will do that. I was just editing those slides up to 5 minutes before the meeting, so I didn't quite get it in there, but I'll get it in by the end of the day. And maybe I noticed a couple typos while I was presenting, so I think I'll clean those up for record the link for all posterity. Right now, the link is just sitting on the hard disk on my laptop, so I have to upload it to a Google Drive location in order to share it. Okay, I think that was it for today's agenda, but we're open to any other questions or free-form discussions. Oh, one last thought that I should have put in the troubleshooting slide, but if going to those logs doesn't help you, we're prepared to accept questions and support requests in the Slack channels. There is a Slack channel unique to the cloud provider. I don't think there is one unique to the storage provider for vSphere, but there is also a link, a VMware user group Slack channel. I guess I don't know if this is official or whether the people who'd respond to storage help requests have a preference for where it goes, but I think that it will get noticed if you put it in the user group channel or the cloud provider channel. Do either of you guys doing this, David or Miles, have a preference for where users should put these?
I don't mind, but I do know the engineers hang out in provider vSphere for sure. So you're probably more likely to get engineer eyes on it if you post in provider vSphere.
Yeah, I'd probably just echo that same comment. Yep.
Okay, does anybody else have any questions, comments, remarks, even suggestions for what we address next month are open? Other things that Miles and I are open to suggestions for is I think we have a deadline for getting an agenda done for the maintainer track session at KubeCon North America, which goes on the air sometime in November. But if any of you users are out there and have topics you'd like to see discussed in detail, throw it out there. If you can't think of it now, just throw it out there on the Slack channel and let us know in the next few days.
Otherwise, it's more than likely going to be VCP to CSI migration. So if you don't want to see that, then give us some ideas.
Okay,
I have one question actually, or a subject that I'm not sure if it has been talked about in a previous one, but is the whole subject of backup in Kubernetes by VMware, whether it has to do with things like a Valero tool or Datrium or any of the castines out there, you know, a little bit of maybe.
Okay, I think we can bring that up. It's been kind of lightly covered in past meetings, and it's also an area that's definitely under rapid development. So this is kind of timely. There's two phases to this where we've got some engineers who are trying to make this open-ended and develop an infrastructure to support things like snapshots on volumes that enable kind of there's a history of lots of backup vendors that have been out there for decades now. And we really have a goal to enable all of them. You know, there are some backup solutions that are Kubernetes unique, but they also can benefit from an underlying infrastructure that would do things like snapshots and keying of applications running inside containers, which in turn are inside VMs if you're on vSphere. And we've got a long built up infrastructure of that. I found that most users who went down a path of using a particular vendor for backups are kind of loath to switch, because maybe if a new vendor comes along and has some really cool Kubernetes unique features, you've still got this inventory of years and years of backups that you're going to have to keep around anyway, just because occasionally you want to see something that was captured in a backup 2 years ago, or you might even have legal requirements that require you to keep those along. So if you were to gather up a new vendor to handle only your Kubernetes, you're still going to have to continue to drag along the older one as well. So you know, we recognize that users often want to stick with their existing vendor just because they've got existing storage and kind of modes of operations with that. So our goal is kind of to support all of them and not be a kingmaker and say, this is your best solution. So if you expect a topic like nominating a best solution, I don't think we'll ever talk about that, but we've even thought about inviting some of these different backup solutions to all come here and give their thoughts on that.
One thing that we could cover, Steve, is I know the engineers that have written the VADP plugin for Valero, so specifically on vSphere, so how it does vSphere level snapshots orchestrated by Valero. So maybe we could get one of the engineers to come along and talk about how we do vSphere level snapshots through something Kubernetes level like Valero.
Okay, yeah, that should be quite doable. But Scott, if you have a particular vendor that you're associated with now, it might help us if you have contacts with that where you could invite them to talk about whatever solution they'd have for Kubernetes backups on the platform. We're open to that.
Yeah, no. So as an integrator, I don't work with a specific, backup provider. I work with whatever the customer uses.
Uh-huh.
But I think more so in the sense of, I think also, the, VADP plugin for Valero would be great to get a better understanding of, because there isn't much data out there for the Valero plugin for vSphere in terms of its, how it's actually working. But more so, I think one of the things that's lacking out there today is something in regards to backups in Kubernetes, and it's not backing up a virtual machine. It's
Right.
very different. That's where, as much as you may want to use a Commvault or whatever other solutions anyone is using for traditional backups, is not necessarily it's not the same thing to back up Kubernetes.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
what the intrinsics of that are.
The VM is certainly involved, and I don't want to drop vendor names here in this public meeting
Sorry.
to plug anybody, but I know some of these vendors who used to have VM backup solutions are adding to this with Kubernetes backup solutions that go side by side with that. So that's kind of what I'm talking about here, where what you want to do is back up the persistent volumes, kind of detached from the VMs that happen to randomly be the one that they were running on at the moment you did the backup, but allow for a mechanism where you can reconstitute that stateful app regardless of where it's running at the time of recovery. And that's a really useful tool. And some of these vendors can still use the snapshotting features and the application kiosks, or at least that's my opinion, that they had built out for the VM world, because some of the kind of off-the-shelf Kubernetes solutions are more like the style of backup of what you'd get if you yank the plug abruptly out of the wall. They don't do things like log truncation and things like that that you really want to have for certain types of applications, to have a more painless recovery option.
Or even incremental backups, which most don't offer today.
Yeah. The other big aspect of backup, I used to work in the backup field, but catalogs are a big deal too. I mean, if you're really doing this at scale, one of the big issues here is just knowing what you've got and where it is. It kind of can seem to work at a small scale of, yes, I developed this, I can back up this database, and then 2 years later, when you've got thousands of them, and you want to maybe selectively have a deletion program, that can be a big issue. Okay, well,
I think we had previously back in June. I think we talked more about that. I had a conversation with Robert Hammond.
right, yeah.
Right.
Is he a part of Valero, or what is he part of storage? Which area is he in?
He's part of the storage business unit, and I think he may be responsible for both storage and the backup that would go to the VADP appliance. I think his role is that he actually was talking about recruiting other vendors too. So I believe he's been interested in getting people from established, all the backup vendors out there to come and work on getting solutions across the board to enable backup of Kubernetes stateful apps to whatever form of backup the user might prefer. But yeah, he was, I think we can get him back for a future meeting. That is, by the way, that meeting got recorded, Scott, if you want to go back and look at it, but I think it was kind of an intro. It's not going to give you the answers. It was just kind of an opening discussion of where we'd like to go on this.
Okay, great. So I'll take a look at that.
But yeah, we'll queue those up for an agenda in future meetings. So Miles and I will go try to recruit some speakers, and we're actually hoping, I don't have great contacts with all the other backup vendors, but we're kind of hoping that maybe users who have contacts with other people might be able to let people know that they're welcome to show up at this meeting and give presentations or participate in discussions. Okay, it's 6 minutes before the hour. Last call for any other comments, suggestions?
I posted in the chat that another possible subject for future is kind of a more in-depth coverage of using zones with Kubernetes for managing the nodes and storage to make sure you get things where you want them. Or
Okay, is this managing zones for purposes of high availability or, you know, the other reasons?
so yes, for that, or on the storage side, you may have, for example, maybe some nodes that aren't in the same cluster, the VMware
Okay, so
cluster,
the
but are
storage
part of
isn't
your,
mountable elsewhere? Okay,
exactly. So you may want to set up and say, hey, only, these pods only work with these zones. So only put them on these nodes so that they have the storage available. Things
okay.
like that.
Okay, I'll make a note of that. The other thing, I know that you're running some on-prem stuff, and I've been kind of playing around with on-prem myself and wondering if one of the aspects of zones might even be dedicated IO devices that aren't available anywhere, you know, because I've taken kind of a wild ride on trying to host home automation on a Kubernetes home lab, and some of my IO is unique to one ESXi and isn't routable into another, but I can imagine that in some of your use cases, you might have some of that going on too.
Yeah, another example would be like maybe you have some GPU nodes and you want some workloads to run there, not on the other nodes.
Okay, great idea. So we'll try to find somebody to talk with authority on those subjects too. Thanks. Okay, final last call. Okay, I'm gonna stop the recording then. It should get uploaded to YouTube in a few days. And we'll see you next month. Bye, everybody.